I'm Anna Sterling Gould. I got my PhD at Duke in literature. And along the way, I was teaching digital humanities classes. So whereas Brian does magic with programming and different tools, I think he brought me into this presentation a bit to speak to the pedagogy side. How do you integrate that into the classroom? And how do we, although Brian does a bit of that, I'm an instructor as well, and I still teach environmental humanities classes, and I am now co-teaching a class called Learning to Fail through the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Department. And I'm the Digital Humanities Specialist at the Franklin Humanities Institute, and I also help co-direct the Story Plus program, which is an undergraduate research program that we run through the Franklin Humanities Institute, and we do public and digital humanities projects with undergraduates. And every year, I'll put in a plug for Story Plus. Faculty and community members at Duke present projects. We hire undergraduates to do kind of 9-to-5 labor, but we also hire graduate mentors to direct those projects. So keep an eye if you're looking for a summer position mentoring students on innovative, interdisciplinary storytelling projects.
I'm Brian Goldberg. I work for Trinity Technology Services. It's a really long way to say I'm an IT guy in Trinity College. Part of my role is to work with faculty and students on digital projects. So my email and Amanda's email is up there. We're both accessible by email for consultations, which is, the first step if you want to do something digital in the classroom is to contact one of us. And this will be a presentation, but because we have Liz and Anna, we can make this into more of a discussion, and you can ask questions anytime along the way. But the idea here is just to give you a high-level overview of what kind of technology and staff support structure we have for trying to help people do digital stuff in the classroom. And so I'm going to tell you all about this, and I'm going to make it seem like it's so simple and easy. And Amanda's actually here to tell you what goes wrong and what you should expect. Yeah, and so we just kind of wanted to give you this balance, because I'm going to say, oh yeah, we have these tools, and you can do this and that, and it's going to be so easy and great, and then Amanda's kind of like, put me in check. So we just wanted to give you a good balance and an idea of what it's really like to try to do digital work in the classroom. So we have the slides up there at goo.gl/U6PH_UX. But at the end of this, I'll get the anyone who put their email on that list, and I'll send this out, because there'll be some links that I think will be useful to give you an idea of what some other instructors have done, and I know you won't remember all those things provided, so it will be. So when we're talking about doing digital pedagogy in the classroom, the first question we have to ask is why. Does anybody want to tell us why they're here? Get a job? No. I think that first and foremost, we just try to simplify it down to a couple ways that the people that we've worked with have approached why they do digital pedagogy in the classroom. And the first one is discovery. And so what we'll do is we'll start out really high level, give you an example of discovery, and then we'll go deep down and look at somebody who did something very specific that falls into this realm. So some of the ways that people do this: discovery, ask humanities questions differently with contemporary media. So a lot of people do things like, study a certain theory or methodology, and they just apply it to more contemporary materials, or they just ask that same question of something that they're not used to studying. Experimentation. This is where, flip the classroom, give the students a little bit more control, try to give them assignments that are less paper-based and more just like, let's see what we can do with the website kind of thing. Public engagement and publicity. So the same thing. So instead of having the students write a paper, the only audience being the faculty, you get to put something up on the web and give feedback and input from other people. And then the last one is track students. So that's what we're talking about with this picture. Yeah?
Can I add one?
I was going to add one too. I might get you. Go.
Okay. Just the idea of bringing research into the classroom. So, for example, with Wired, we're already doing some of those methodologies as research, but then translating that into the classroom as part of it. So, thinking about overall university goals that can be.
And that's a good point. Like, you know, say you're doing research on a certain topic and then you teach a course. Oftentimes, faculty and teachers bring their research into the classroom, the books that they read, and because they're working on the research in those books, they bring them in the classroom just to keep the mind fresh there. You can do the same thing with technology. Yeah.
And so one of this kind of why digital humanities, when someone comes to me and says, I want to use digital tools, that's an interesting question. But then you also have people who are digital curious, right? And then those people who are skeptics. So some of the things that I like to talk about when I talk about digital humanities is that you can use digital tools to ask your humanities question no matter your department. You can ask humanities questions of digital tools, which is something necessary in our contemporary moment. You can use digital tools in research and in teaching as sort of discovery. So let's say this kind of distant reading thing where you put a whole bunch of text into a text analysis and you can kind of sometimes discover things that you could not otherwise discover without the digital tools. Experimentation, that can be whether you're visualizing data in a different way, maybe not discovery, but you're experimenting with different ways of understanding the data that you have or finding new data or presenting that data. And with the public engagement is that even if you have your students blogging, right, and you allow that to be public, that's some sort of public engagement. Many of our digital humanities projects, if they are on the web, are inherently public. And so you're introducing this idea not only of getting students engaged with publics, but you open up conversations where you can speak to your students about what should be public, how should we represent ourselves in a public space. And even if your class is not on digital humanities, this is an opportunity, doing a digital humanities project with your students is an opportunity to say, even just briefly, what are the ethics of putting this online and making it public? What are, do I want to use my real name or not? And these kinds of questions that I like to just throw at them while we're doing digital projects that don't naturally fit into another class, but are really important to humanities research.
And then the final one is kind of a byproduct. Like, we're all going to be good faith, and we're not going to say you're going to do this just to get people into your class. But if you do technology, you'll get people who are interested, maybe somewhat in the topic that you're teaching, but want to learn a certain technology. So the introduction of technology could actually be intriguing for some students.
And finally, one that's not on here, it is highly sellable, right? And I know that you tease, but absolutely. That if you can talk when you're on the job market, or even if you're going versatile or alt-ac, that these skills, digital pedagogy, learning the tools, teaching the tools, are skill sets for your own toolbox that you can go out into the world with, but also on the market. I don't know how many times I read innovative pedagogy and digital pedagogy as things that are, desired. So these are also ways to push yourself to learn new skills because it is a different way of teaching.
So just some examples of what we're talking about. So just going back, we're going to go down this list and give you examples of what each one is. And so Amanda touched on this a little bit. I know it's possible to see up here, but when you get these presentations, there's a link out. But this is discovery. So somebody took Pride and Prejudice and basically took all the words, threw it into a computer program, and had it spit out how it uses certain pronouns and gendered nouns and things like that, and then put it up against some other Victorian novels so that you can see how that novel either fits into potential conventions that you necessarily couldn't see trying to read 1,000 books, because who can read 1,000 books? But it's just this kind of like high level, like let me see if I can discover something by defamiliarizing myself with the text instead of reading it in context about the period in the book. Let's get out of it. Let's put it up against other books in a totally unfamiliar way and see if we can't find and discover something about this text that we couldn't discover because something that we couldn't read 1,000 books in a semester.
Something fun about this kind of assignment with your students, and there are really sophisticated tools for doing this, and then rather easy tools that you can plug in and make a word cloud, right? There are sophisticated and unsophisticated tools, and we'll get to that towards the end of the presentation. But some of the things that you can thinking about with your students is, you get this data and these kinds of charts or visualizations, but we need to tell our students that the technology is not making the argument. but the students still have to make that critical argument. And that is another thing that you can help them, that you can teach them, is how do we make, we're given this bit of, so this to me, this kind of spread, this is legible material just like a book would be, okay? And so this is not an argument, but you can make an argument with it.
And then you have a methodology that's different, right? So it's talking about words that are more physical versus abstract. So these are just, you're already coming up with certain ideas to try to tell the computer to separate this in different ways. So discovery is the method here. And then from there we just go out looking at the material in a different way. So this is a project, it was a visiting faculty came here for humanities for a larger name was Meredith Goldsmith, and she was, she studied, blanking on her name, Edith Wharton, thank you. And Edith Wharton is, a very realistic writer, so when she would write about the city, it would be very specific. So Meredith had the idea, like, it's so specific, I should be able to geolocate the movement of these characters because the novelist is so specific. So she gave it a pass, and what she ended up finding was things like, you can see class played out in the movement on the geospatial map because certain characters would be in certain class, and they wouldn't go outside of a certain window. And then when they did, you can see plot changes and things like that. So, it wasn't any great discovery, but she brings it into the classroom now, and it's a new way for the students to engage with the materials, instead of just reading it. Now they're reading it, trying to figure out where these characters are, learning some new methods like GIS, and gaining a whole bunch of skill in the process of trying to learn what the novel is about. So, kind of cool. Another visiting faculty person that I worked with was Amadou Fofana. What he did is he studied West African cinema, and so one way to engage the students with his material was there's a certain group that's funded by UNICEF and other groups to go into rural areas in West Africa to show public health documentaries that stop the spread of disease and stuff. But to be sensitive to these groups and their culture, they start having them produce their own public health announcements, and then they show them West African film. And like the history of West African film, they don't get shown in West Africa. It was owned by the French. All the production was owned by the French. And so these are some of the first times these movies are being shown in West Africa. And this mobile cinema group that goes into highly rural areas. And so he was trying to figure out a way to bring that element into the class, and he didn't know how. And then he found out this group's actually on social media. And so we were able to use Twitter and have the students work with Twitter to figure out where this mobile cinema is going, and then begin to map that. So we get to see, not only where this group is going, but this idea of cultural sensitivity and where it's going. And then the students get to see what the landscape is like in this. So it's very different than watching like a Ousmane Sembène film. Not only do you get to watch those, but you get to understand what they mean culturally for this group. So it's a really cool project. And another one I just want to bring up really quickly. This is actually a student project in Jennifer Ahorn Dotson's class. She teaches in the Thompson Rating Program. It's a student protest and social media course. And so I'll go into this more in detail, but just to give you an idea. So this was one student who, over a couple weeks, worked with me to collect millions of tweets on March for Our Lives. So he's trying to document that one day. And so he's just done some Tableau graphs, and he stuck it into this website, which I'll talk more about later, because once I go into how you structure these kind of assignments for students, it will make a lot more sense. But just to give you an idea, she was focused on student protest. She got the students go off and figure out what they wanted to do. And so this student found me, we got these tweets, and then he was able to do these Tableau visualizations, which are actually pretty cool, not too difficult to do. And then another one is just letting the students be more empowered to do different kinds of assignments. And so I'll let Amanda talk more about this one, because social movements, she actually worked with that application in the class.
So this is an example of instructors coming to Brian with an idea. And it actually came out of our social movements lab at the Franklin Humanities Institute. And since I worked there, I was consulting on the project. They wanted to map social movements. And this is what happens in labs, also probably in the migrations lab, is that you want to do a project, and how do we integrate that? And so I proposed that we actually have our students do it. And at the time, I was teaching a class on environmental movements, environmental activism. So it provided a good platform for me to work with the director or the lab manager, Eli, to get our students involved and to work with Brian and to create a project. So what we ended up doing is that we created a website where the students could input information about social movements, social actions, and social groups, and then we could map all of those. And the idea was that not only would we get students we assigned each student, they could choose their own movement. In my class, they had to choose environmental movements. In Eli's class, they chose movements that interested them. And they did a deep dive into putting in information in this, what is essentially a database, about that movement and where its actions are. And so Brian created a website where we could link social actions with social groups, and so we could actually discover, right, that this environmental group is actually at all the same events as this Black Lives Matter group, like what's going on here. And so it allowed the students to kind of discover these overlaps where they hadn't seen them before. So that was a fun way of getting them to, even if we knew it, right, it's fun for the students to map these things and discover them on their own. And so that's how we, and I just made it a part of my classroom project. I introduced the website to them, how to use it, and they ran with it. So we can talk more about that, how to actually introduce the projects to the class. And take note, this was not a digital humanities class. This was an environmental activism class. This was just part of one of their projects, was to contribute to the social movements map. So there are ways that you can teach a digital humanities class. Teach a class that's about half, right, if you're doing a digital Edith Wharton, or just a regular class where you integrate digital tools into your pedagogy. There are all, 3 ways that you can do that.
Yeah, and so just to give you a quick example of what this looks like. So as Amanda said, her and Eli came to me. I helped them set up the website. And what the students end up doing are like these entries, almost like a Wikipedia entry, right? So like Eli and Amanda decided on the structure for the site. I built that structure into the site so that when the students come, they know exactly what kind of information they're going to need, and then they can just start to enter it in, and then you produce this site, which you get varying levels of things. So like some people do a few examples of tools that you can use for digital pedagogy later. There's a C also, so this particular example, they didn't link any with any groups or anything else, and they have no further information. So I wanted to just show you this, that the process is contact somebody like me, Amanda, Liz, Hannah, and then we kind of consult you, or Learning Innovations as well, and they can consult you on how to get started. And then if you're doing a longer, like this is an example of like a longer semester-long project. And what I mean by semester-long is you're not doing the digital stuff all semester, but the digital stuff fits into what you're teaching all semester, as opposed to this is just one lesson in the semester. This is a whole semester thing, right? So that's when you would use a website like this. So we structure this, and then the students are just given, like, this was 1 or 2 assignments, depending on what class you were. So.
And let me tell you, so if I had been teaching a class on digital activism, for instance, I would have done the assignment differently. I would have actually had this. So this project, Eli, Brian, and I met several times and created the website and the back-end database ourselves. And that is actually incredibly important and interesting work, that building, because Brian is very good about asking, well, what information do you want to display? Who is your audience? How do we want them to connect with this material? How are you going to say, for a social group, for instance, how are we going to map that? Do we map its headquarters? And so these questions that you don't think about until you begin entering information into specified categories in a database or on a website, and then that information becomes really useful. So had I been teaching a class on digital activism, I would have actually brought Brian in, or spoke with Brian, and had my students help make those decisions, because they don't think about that stuff, right? So one of the really interesting examples, you're like, yeah, they don't think about that. But even in humanities, We like really fuzzy things. We like to have fuzzy dates. And we like to have, you know, in history we don't always know the date. Well, that person was born about then, right? So even as an entry as simple as a birth date, we sometimes don't know. So what do you do with that? And in a digital project, you're forced to make decisions. Those are, I think they bring a bit of curiosity to the project for students, as well as some critical thinking skills. So if you are teaching a class that isn't about digital humanities or about a particular project, actually having the students involved in making those decisions can be a really good pedagogical tool, and have them critically thinking about how do we map this place in this book, and where is that place now, and how do we decide, and who moved the borders, and what does that mean? There are a lot of questions that come up that are very humanities-based questions that really don't normally come up when you're talking about many topics.
So when it comes to this, we're talking about exploration, and sometimes exploration means just giving up control over what you might think is the right answer here, or what is enough information, because you're going to have students of varying degrees of wanting to participate. So sometimes you just kind of, exploration means not only exploring the topic, but exploring your patience and exploring your knowledge of the subject. And then we have just one more example, Project Box. There's a timeline here. You'll get the slide. And then, the final example is you engage with the public, right? So that first one, I have to go back because I didn't time this very well, is a pop art class that Esther Gavar taught here. She worked with my unit and Hannah, I think originally, to do an Omeka exhibit of a real physical exhibit she was going to put on in the Nasher. I think it's going on now. Or it's over.
It's coming.
It's coming. But to get her students participating in that, she had them create an Omeka exhibit where they got to curate their own exhibit with the same collection that was going to come in here and be curated physically. So it was a way for her students to engage with the materials and do it in a very public way. That site's no longer in existence because she doesn't want that to be confused with the actual exhibit that's going on. But a good example of a project that is still going on that does exactly that same kind of thing is the Sonic Dictionary. Sonic Dictionary was started by Mary Wingold in 2014, something?
When she was a graduate student here too.
Yeah, in the English department, right? So it started out by Liz's unit supporting it, creating an Omeka site. And what this site basically is allows the students to go out anywhere, record sounds, and then create metadata. And it's basically a dictionary of sounds. And the idea is to get students engaged with a different medium, right? So for Mary Kate, she was like, we don't study sound enough. So she wanted to privilege sound in her class. So she created this resource where the students could collect these things, and they could begin having discussions and make arguments about sound in ways that hadn't been typically done in English before. And that project has now grown, transferred to our unit. We've moved it from Omeka to Drupal, and now people from different universities are using it. So here's a picture of Furman News. So there's a professor at Furman who's having her students add entries into the database. And so they add these entries, they create exhibits around some of these entries, so like sounds that they think go together. So it's just kind of, again, the students are curating, but now it's a very publicly visible thing. And I think this Furman story is basically talking about how that faculty member has now got a grant from the university to support digital stuff in the classroom from using this site. So another good example, this was a long time going, and it's still going. And just wanted to give you an example of, sometimes they're finite, like pop art, where they go up for a year or semester and then go down. Sometimes they go on and they go on to other universities. So, but both of them are meant to engage students publicly with the materials that you cover. Any questions so far? So we're going to go from that high level why do it to more about how you can do it. Yeah.
Do you ever get pushback from students on that public engagement? Like,
I I haven't.
About this like private space of the classroom, or like.
No, I actually give them a whole spiel about if a future employer Googled you, what would they find? And if we add your name to this public blog, they're going to find that instead. And so I have never, and I've always offered, if you want to use a pseudonym, use it and let me know what it is. None of them ever do. So I frame it in that this is actually going to be good for you in a way. I have at one point had, in my environmental activism class, had a student get pretty heated about something, and he actually emailed me and he said I'd better not make this blog public. But that was the only time anyone had any issue with, I've tricked them into thinking it's good for them.
Yeah, and everybody that I work with, I mean, I don't know how they get around it. They have students fill out forms ahead of time that says, you know, do I have permission to share this, even when the stuff is not shared. So that's one of my guidelines moving forward is give permission. I think maybe Hannah, you can speak better to this because you're in the classes where you do a lot of it.
We do actually, and that's, so Art History and Visual Studies has their own form anyway because we have so many courses that create media that go into public exhibitions. So we have students sign permission forms just saying that we can use their work publicly after the class ends.
So yeah,
And
you know, even if
any issue with it.
that would be, you know, a guideline for me is like if you're gonna do this or thinking about doing this, not sure, do that anyway. Get permission from the students. Ask them ahead of time. You know, you might put this online. Like a lot of the people I work with in the class are not actually putting anything online, but they have long-term hopes of going back and creating a website that they can use for future classes. So like we'll talk about this process more, but sometimes it just starts out with these mini assignments and then grows to something larger. So to have that permission from the students who are doing just the mini assignments will benefit you down the road as well.
And I always try to offer alternatives, especially, I mean, when it's a digital humanities class or a class that's very obviously working on a project, you lay it out at the beginning and say, this is what we're going to be doing. If you're uncomfortable with that, it's probably not the best class for you because there really aren't any alternatives. But if you're just integrating it into a regular course, I try to offer alternatives. Like if you don't want to publicly blog, use the word Mickey Mouse, I don't care. So there are either at the beginning make it clear and get permission, or if it's just a part of the class, offering an alternative.
So let's start focusing on how we can do this now. So I think the best way to become a swole Jacques Derrida is to just think about what students can do. That's the easiest thing, right? You know, as instructors, you go into the classroom and we love our students and they're great, but they look for loopholes. They love animosity, I think. I don't know, arguments. But so when you're introducing technology, it's not like you're just throwing away all the conflicts between the instructor and the students in traditional classrooms. So always be extra considerate of the students here because you're bringing them into a realm that's probably foreign for a lot of them, regardless of what we call them digital natives. So ask, in order to know what the students can do, it's just easiest to know what they can't do. And what they can't do is go out and find whatever information you ask them to find and then figure out how to structure it and represent it on the web by themselves. Just not a very good model.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Actually, one thing that we have found that's handy is we have a very close relationship with our subject librarian. And so actually that's a major part of all of our digital humanities courses is that we pull Lee Sorensen into classes and he actually works with the students from that end. And that way we're able to make that connection back to creating humanities data.
Yeah, so a good thing to do would say, okay, you can go out to the library and find whatever information you want, but here are 3 tools that you can use to try to represent that, right? So you scaffold them by limiting their choices. If you give them unlimited choices, they're going to get frustrated. They're going to say you didn't give them enough support to successfully do this assignment. So that's one. I would not ever have them pick the tool without your guidance either. So say everybody's going to work with the same materials and you get to decide how to represent that. I would still try to encourage them to use certain tools over other ones, right? So just don't say, here's some information, figure out how to represent it. Actually tell them, here, if you want to do it this way, there's this kind of tool, or if you want to do it that way, there's that kind of tool. And then finally, don't have them work alone, and you have to give them pretty thorough guidance about what your expectations are, right? So So just for an example, to go back to this social movement site, I don't know how Eli structured it, I don't know how Amanda structured it, but I know that I could have said in this, if you want to get X grade, you should have A, B, and C tabs filled in, right? So there's a really easy way that you can structure this, and this is why I say, don't have them develop the structure. If you do things like this, develop the structure, then you can develop criteria that they can follow to say, hey, if you want an A, this is my expectation. These 5 tabs will be filled out, right? If you want an A+, they'll be filled out very well. If you want a C, 3 of them, right?
I just want to underscore that. I think having both assessment criteria and guidelines go hand in hand, and I really like what you said earlier, Amanda, about having these discussions with the students. One of the conversations Mary Kay Lingold had early on with students around the Sonic Dictionary was the guidelines for how to enter information about objects that they were uploading. And that became a conversation about discovery. It became a conversation about how you know what an object is, why you include the information that you include. So the whole building became part of better understanding of the work that they were doing.
So again, if you just say, we're going to use Omeka and we're going to do whatever, you're going to be in for a long, long ride.
Yeah, so I think another way to say this is don't assume they know how to use anything. Right? Don't even Twitter and Instagram, don't assume they know how to do it well, and don't just throw an assignment at them. So by saying, and so like, what students can't do, you often don't assume you know what they can do. Right? Because although we have digital natives, not all of them use a particular tool or are familiar with a particular tool, or perhaps they're very familiar with one, and the one that you want them to use is not intuitive to them because they're used to looking at something else. And so when you're going to assign a tool or a project, build in time in your syllabus and your schedule to teach them how to use it, or scale back a bit and use a tool that is very quick and easy to learn. And with the are we getting to assessment later? Are we going through that again?
I mean, we can go into it in more detail. I just think we're doing things very generally here.
Yeah, so, and this, I mean, this kind of goes...
We're just focused on what students can do, right? So, just because you're doing digital work, like if you have expectations that are through the roof, you're in for another long ride, right? So like, we know what students do with traditional kind of projects and just don't expect anything all that different. And because like Amanda said, you're introducing potentially 2 new things, a technology and a subject. And that's, you know, not the most easy thing to tackle. And so this is where guidelines and stuff, and then of course we brought up before, get student permission. Because if you don't, you're gonna run into some issue here.
Can I make a plug? Just for that it's absolutely possible to introduce content and technology at the same time.
Yeah.
It's great to do that when you're designing your syllabus and thinking about the course.
Yeah.
And just to make another plug for DLI, thinking about how to make learning the tool and learning the content align would be also something that can really make better, efficient use of your time.
And so I know that the 4 of us who work in digital tools, and I'm sure Michael as well, is that the question of which digital tool to use is almost always inherently wrapped up in the project. That you, some people come to me and they say, I want to use a timeline, what can I map on my timeline? And we can find something. But if someone comes to me and they say, I have this book and it's about this, and I'll say, well, is it spatially represented or is it represented in time? Well, yeah, time is an important question. So we can use our humanities questions, like how do I frame this? Is this something that exists in time or in space or in both? And then we can match the tool to the project. What do you want to do? It's always inherent. So learning them together is not a bad idea. And with this, you know, one of the things that this create guidelines, create assessment, for your digital projects, you need to create an assessment rubric just like you would create for an essay, and they are not the same. So these are things that you really ideally should be thinking about while you're making the syllabus, and not throwing it in the middle. Although we can, if you come to me, we'll figure out a way to throw it in the middle. We can do that. But also creating the assignment with the assessment, creating those together is also important, because then you're going to know, then the students will know what to expect. You'll know what you're grading them on, because if you haven't thought about it, it is different with digital tools. And then they're better able to provide, you know, you just have to have they have to know what they're doing, and they need those assessments. And one of the things that I've done in my class, in my Digital Humanities class, one of the earlier parts of the class to introduce them to Digital Humanities projects, I found an online rubric for evaluating Digital Humanities projects, and I gave that to them. And then I put them in groups, and they were given really high-level Stanford, Harvard Digital Humanities projects. And in their groups, they had to use that rubric that I found online from a pretty prominent Digital Humanities person. So it was a great list, actually. They had to use that list and then grade these professional projects. And while doing that, they had to grade that rubric. They had to say, well, I don't really know why. I think that was silly. Like point number 4, asking this about this project, that doesn't fit. So what that did is it introduced them to assessment criteria for Digital Humanities projects. It introduced them to Digital Humanities projects, and they started thinking, well, I would do this differently, or I would grade this differently. And then, as they were saying, well, I wouldn't ask this, but I think this is an important criteria for evaluation, we made a new list, and that list became the list by which I graded their final Digital Humanities projects. So they were involved in a way, and so by the end, when they were doing the Digital Humanities projects, they understood exactly what they needed to give me. And there was some wiggle room and some ambiguity, as there are with all of our humanities assignments, right? But they were pretty clear on what the Digital Humanities project was, how it can be evaluated, and then how their projects were going to be evaluated. And you don't need to go through that entire process, although it didn't take that much time, right? Maybe 2 classes, or 1.5 even. It's very doable. But it did give them, I mean, you need to have that assessment. And also, if you're going to work with Brian and create, or Liz and Hannah, and create a more robust website, you can be thinking about assessment at that time as well. What do we want the students to do? What do we want the students to fill in? And so one of the issues that we had with the social movements project is that what I want my students to do, what I wanted them to do, was different than what Eli wanted them to do. And so you do have blanks. But if the website had just been mine, there wouldn't be any blanks because I would have known what I was going to ask my students to do, and they would have done that, right? But with Eli and I both contributing, his students were doing something a bit different, and so that's why you see the assessment criteria for the students was different, and then you get a website with blanks. So that's an issue to think about, that when you're working, if you're doing a more sophisticated project, thanks, Hannah!
Thank you.
If you're doing a more sophisticated project and working with Brian or Hannah or Liz at the beginning, thinking about assessment then is good.
So these are just those very specific examples. These are just general guidelines. If you're thinking about doing this, the first question you ask yourself, how much of it will be digital? Like I said before, like if you're going to do a website, that's going to be basically the whole class digital. And what I mean by that is the product you're going to produce is directly correlated to the subject that you're going to cover throughout the whole semester. And then we'll talk about a couple other varieties of how much digital in the class we can do. I know the other thing you can do is have defined learning outcomes, right? So we talked about it some, like, you know, sometimes somebody will produce something digitally on the web. I know this is self-explanatory, but sometimes you just need to be told this to believe it. Somebody will produce something that's not the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. And we're all aesthetes in a way, and we want everything to be aesthetically pleasing. But sometimes learning the information and proving that the student is learning the information is more important than the thing that they produce. And so you kind of, this is part of the things you have to wrestle with when you're deciding what are the learning outcomes, right? Like it's not about how pretty the thing looks. I want them to learn this, and I want to come up with ways of how you can assess how they learn, right? And then of course we talked about it, create guidelines and documentation. You want to limit the amount of frustration you have with your students anytime you can walk them through a process, through some sort of documentation or guidelines that will ease your being emailed.
But yeah, also, I mean, ease it on yourself. If you have these guidelines for students, you can say, we'll refer back to the guidelines. Because you're going to get questions and maybe a lot. So you need to know the tool, and you also need to know what your assessment criteria is. So this is why you create the assessment criteria, you know, before you assign the project.
But even before you ask those questions, or maybe while you're asking those questions.
Oh, you added me!
Yeah, I added you. Talk to people like us, right? So you saw Hannah, Liz, Amanda, myself. Hannah brought up subject librarians, like anybody learning innovation, anybody that you can bounce your ideas off of, talk to them, because we have other jobs that we do, but those other jobs are boring. I'm speaking to myself now sometimes, and so
We're on
talking
camera.
to people. Ed Gomes will never see this. So these are some of our most fun moments. So we are definitely intrigued and excited to try to work with you. So as you're thinking through those questions from the last slide, feel free to contact people like Amanda and myself. That's part of our job. So we talked about, the first question you asked is how much of it digital, right? So we talked about the whole semester approach, right? So these are websites, digital exhibits, databases, and just in a nutshell, this is when the subject that you are teaching is going to be played out in the digital product that you produce at the end. So the social movement site is actually a really good example. In Amanda's class, they were talking the whole semester about environmental justice and certain groups. In Eli's class, they're talking about all these different social movements and groups and stuff. So everything they talked about culminates into this final project that they produced. And that's why we got together before the semester, started ironing out some of the things about, what you can put into the site, how it's going to be displayed, because it was really a whole semester project. This digital thing depended on everything that was going to happen in the first months. So that's one type of digital project. Another one is just kind of the replace of paper. And this is just that, right? So instead of having them write a 20-page paper, you might say you can use tools X, Y, and Z, and pick one, and do the same thing that you might do in a paper, but now you have the creativity of using this new medium to try to do that. And then the final one is kind of a lesson plan based one. So maybe a subset of a unit that you teach on a subject, and that subset might lend itself really well to some sort of temporal digital project. And so you kind of create lesson plans that help them understand the information, like Amanda was saying, in coordination with learning a particular tool. So we'll go through some examples.
And I'll add a 2.5, a 2.5 here. So I have students write in my Digital Humanities class transmedia essays, I think is what I call it, something stupid. But they write these transmedia essays for their final project, where it's the equivalent of a 20-page final research paper like we like to have in the humanities. But they have to create a digital element and integrate that into the paper so that the paper could not exist without it, and the thing could not exist without the paper. So then they have to think about how to really, so it's not a research paper illustrated with images, right? If you're going to illustrate with images, then they have to annotate those images and use digital tools to do that and really integrate that into the narrative of their research paper. So I've had students run the gamut from creating stop motion animation films along with their essays. I had someone who put brain waves, and he was doing an article on a research paper on bioart. And so we actually took brainwaves and put them into music so that you could hear them. And I've had students create little videos or do timelines or mind maps or word clouds. I kind of open it up to them, and they have to come and, I have to approve what they're going to do. But it's these transmedia essays where they integrate it into the research paper. So that's maybe a 2.5.
Yeah. So, it's just on a scale from doing prep before class with IT people and pedagogy support people to picking a couple tools that a student may use to maybe having to learn a little bit something more, like in the case of a lesson plan, if you're doing podcasting, bless you, knowing a little bit about how to create audio or how to record audio, or if you're doing something like the map you saw of Edith Wharton, knowing a little bit about how geospatial stuff works. So it asks a little bit more than just picking a tool, and then the digital project is like, you have to really think about how this is going to integrate into your class.
I'm just curious how you all have dealt with the in-class time versus out-of-class time for projects.
So it depends. This depends on how integral it is to the topic. So if I'm teaching a digital humanities class, then we have in-class time to do projects and in-class time to experiment, and in-class time to do demos. If it's part of an assignment, I can do a quick demo and let them go and contact me with questions. So
Sorry, do you ever do like lab time or others? I mean, Wired obviously does a lot of lab time, but I'm supporting people at institutions that don't have that kind of setup.
So in my classrooms, no.
Yeah.
I didn't, there was no it didn't disrupt or change the actual schedule in any way. And I didn't offer other classes. And you know, to add to that ask somebody slide, there are so many resources, and it's not really going to help those off campus, but Duke has there's so many resources for students to learn how to do stuff.
Right.
There's GIS, there's data, there's digital media labs, they can learn audio, they can take, so when I say that you need to know what the project is, but you don't actually have to be an expert at whatever the tool is, right, because they have you want to make sure that they know where to go. But as for, you know, how much class time, it depends. If it's an integral part of the class, then it's an integral part of the class. And you use those class periods not just to learn the tools, but to ask humanities questions of those tools. What does this mean? How are we using it critically? How are we using it differently than we use it in our regular lives? How are we going to engage? Things like that. And I also, and I think we might come to it, so you kind of have two. This is again kind of another, like, you know, 1 to 3. You can do a really sophisticated project and ask Brian to help and have him do some magic that he does because he does. Or you can use free, open source, easy tools online, like word clouds and Padlet and these things that are free. And in my non-digital humanities classes, I had preferred those. Because the point is not to teach them a new digital skill, it's to get them experimenting with digital tools to see if they can find something or discover something interesting. So I don't want to spend class time teaching them how to do something, and I don't want them to spend hours learning how to do a tool either.
Right.
I want them to test around with, you know, put that whole book into word cloud and see what word comes up the most, and let's talk about that. Right? It might mean nothing, but it might surprise us in some way. So word cloud, you can just open up the website, stick the text in, copy and paste, right? And so that's another, you know, there's drawbacks and there's pluses and minuses to that, and it depends on what the class is, right?
Yeah, it's a relative question, and I think it's something we're still trying to figure out here. So some of the things we're trying to explore is like, can we use some sort of system to help faculty, you know, just even if it's just curating videos that are already out there for free, and then putting it in a system that allows you to do some sort of assessment. So, because we can't be in the classroom, sometimes the faculty don't necessarily know how to use that tool, but we still want to try to incentivize people. So we're still trying to figure that out, but I think Amanda gave a really good, it's a relative. Right. So if it's something that's really imperative to the class, you know, take a day or two, right? So like for the Sonic Dictionary, Mary Kate, I think, has them record sounds in class. They talk about how to do this, right? She has extensive guidelines, which we'll look at a little bit later. But then I think for Eli's class, we did all the structuring ahead of time. I don't think he ever walked them through. We never created documentation, and somehow they still produce something. So it's also one of those you live and you learn kind of scenarios. But kind of piggyback off of that idea of like, what tools to use, and you know, sometimes pick easier ones than harder ones. So we're going to go through the tools now, and I'll try to place them in like what context we use these tools.
And let me say, when we say easy and hard, we sort of mean familiar and unfamiliar, really.
Or
what kind of knowledge and what kind of skills are required to use it.
How intuitive something is versus is it a learned skill that we have. So the first tools that, you know, we've seen, Social Movements, Sonic Dictionary, those are both Drupal. We've done WordPress is very similar. Talked about Omeka. They're all what's called content management systems. And what these basically allow you to do is have the student enter in a piece of content, and then the system figures out how to display it. So you just worry about how you structure those individual pieces of content. But because these tools take up some planning and structuring, they're much more advanced to use, right? So you wouldn't typically do an Omeka assignment if it was just a small little thing where it was just a part of a lesson plan, or you had certain information that you wanted to have the students display in different ways, I would not recommend something like Omeka, because those require thinking about how does this fit into the class, how are you going to scaffold the students' learning, how to use something like WordPress, Omeka, or Drupal, and then most importantly, how are you going to scaffold them to produce the output that you want, whether that's meeting ahead of time to structure the site, or like with Omeka, which out of the box allows you to create exhibits. How do you evaluate the quality of their exhibits, right? So these require more thinking, and so
That's why that question of assessment is good too, because you might not know. You create a website and you're like, well, I don't really know how to grade this now, right? So that's why assessment is good. And another thing that I have done in my digital humanities classes is that those transmedia essays that they all create, at the end of that class, another part of their final project is to work collaboratively on creating an online journal for their articles. So they create a website using Duke WordPress, and everybody has an art, everybody has a page where they put their essays. And what I do with that is I assign roles. People kind of apply to be, I'm going to be I'm going to be the one who opens the site. I'm going to be the one who designs the site. I'm going to be the one who decides what the title and the byline are going to look like, and then send that to everybody so everybody's page looks the same. I'm going to be the one who creates the bio page and put little bios of the students. So that's also a way of creating kind of a website. And that's kind of at the end of the class. They've already done their essays, and sometimes I offer bonus points for those who will take leadership roles. But giving them roles is another way to, number one, kind of ensure things get done. Because if you just say, okay, class, create a website, if you don't have someone taking points, it's not going to be done. So giving them roles is a bit of accountability, but also makes the work seem more manageable, and the work is actually more manageable. So they each have just different tasks.
And so here's the Sonic Dictionary, so to give you an idea of how this works. So for each student has to go out, record the audio, so they need to learn that component. And then they come back to the site, and this site just allows them to upload the information about the site. And so for some of these, creator description, contributor, format, it's a pretty straightforward thing. But there's some metadata sometimes that are more difficult, like things like tags, right? Tags are meant to link this information up with other information in the database. And 99% of the time you'll click one of these links and you won't see any other media. And of course there's a click on one of that. You won't see any other media except for that particular tag. But this system, because it's pre-built ahead of time, just allows the student to enter in that information, right? And so it allowed Mary Caton, who's the professor, to create these really extensive guidelines that walk the students through not only how to use Audacity to create sound, but then how to add things to this website, right? So a lot of her focus was creating these guidelines, and now that she's done it, she can just say to the students, go out, create this sound, put it in the database, and if you need reference, this is your first line.
And don't get scared. I mean, this is a project that has gone on for years, and she didn't have a 25-page document the first time she taught it, right? So don't think that you need to have this.
You don't have this yet?
Yeah, don't get overwhelmed. And there are, again, there's a whole rainbow, there's a whole spectrum of projects.
Yeah,
and
so this started out as integrating in the whole class, but now because she's created these guidelines as well, instructors from other classes can just incorporate this in. And she's done this really great thing where, with that in mind, she's created this resource that helps other instructors figure out how to create lesson plans and incorporate this site into their classroom. And this website has grown because of Mary Kate and these things that she's done. So.
And she put an incredible amount of time to also be aware of your time, not to discourage you, but be honest about what time you have and what resources you have to do this. And I mean, as graduate students, you're teaching, you're writing, your job applying, you're doing all kinds of things. So do be mindful of, although these, I'm sure that this actually helped Mary Kate. I mean, she was able to talk about this on the job market. And I had my own digital project, and I was talking about it on the market as well, right? And so, but you need to decide for yourself if the time and energy are worth it. Yes?
I was wondering, when you
CMS that you use? Because I'm not
I just
familiar
use
with
Duke WordPress.
So
So the sites at Duke.
yeah, sites.duke.edu.
So for every class, we used it before. So if you log into sites.duke.edu, if you have a class, your class will actually show up and you can create a course, a WordPress site under Duke server, right? That if you associate it with your class, all your students are already populated as users. So and the OIC people can help you with that.
And how have students, because I think WordPress always is like one of the easiest CMSs I've ever used. Do students feel the same way?
Yes, mine haven't really used and in the classes that I teach, I create a WordPress site for the class. It's my class syllabus. You can see that if you go to my website, you can see all of them if you want some examples. And then on the first day, when they introduce themselves, I actually have them log into the site, write their first blog, which is name, where you're from, major, 3 interesting things you read today. And they publish that blog, and then they say that out loud and introduce themselves. So by the end of the first day, they've already published their first blog. So that's my opportunity, not only to, it's an icebreaker, but it also lets me see, you know, if anyone says I don't know how to log in or I'm new, we get that done within 10 minutes. So then they know how to blog, if they didn't already.
Yeah, and that's a good place to start. WordPress is easier in that, like, you could, like Amanda said, just create a post and there it is, whereas it's somewhat foreign, like, you know, these sites where they enter in information and then the pages get structured. Like, how does somebody enter a piece of content and it shows up on the home page without them doing anything, right? So that's a little bit foreign to students, but I think more importantly for the instructors, you have to really think about this structure, whereas WordPress, you can get the things up there, and if you have the time at the end, like Amanda said, you can restructure it to organize it in certain ways. Whereas if you use something like Drupal or even Omeka, you have to have a clear understanding of the content that you're using and how you want it to be structured before you would use.
And this goes back to that the tool matches the content. And so if you were to have a project and say, I want to do this, and you come to Brian or I, we would be able to tell you, oh, Drupal is going to be best for that, or WordPress is going to be best for that, or Omeka is going to be best for that. So they each have their own, it isn't arranged from hardest to easiest, they each have their own particular uses.
Strengths.
Yeah.
And so this, and again, it doesn't have to be, this has to be done one semester. You can start out with small little projects that then grow as you teach the class again the next semester. And then you say, okay, now I have a feeling for what the students are going to produce and how I want to try to organize it. So now I can structure a website, so I'm going to do a website. And these aren't in any order, we just put them this way, right? This is, like Amanda said, hardest to easiest. It's just 1, 2, 3, right? So some easier tools to use, and these are tools that I would say are more about that kind of like replace a paper assignment. The first one to talk about is Sway, and Sway is basically like, I'm not a huge Microsoft fan, but we do have Microsoft Office here, and it is in the Office suite, and it's like a combination between, I would say, PowerPoint and Prezi. You have the ability to work with 3 templates where you can do kind of like a vertical or horizontal storytelling, multimedia thing, or you can do like a PowerPoint-based slide. But it has a lot more pizzazz and like, I guess high-end functionality. Like you can do some really cool stuff with images and videos in this platform that you couldn't necessarily do.
It's one of those great tools that look like you spend a lot of time with.
Yes.
I love those.
And so I'm gonna click on these, and here's my disclaimer. I don't say these are good, and I know faculty are using these in the class, and their students are producing these, but they don't follow up with me to let me know that they're actually using them, so I just have to find examples online. These examples are meant to show you what kind of functionality these things could do. They are not necessarily me saying these are good examples. Disclaimer over.
You're not saying they're bad either.
So this is kind of the things that I'm talking about. So say you were doing some historical assignment. This is called a slider window. I don't know what this user is trying to do between these 2 images, but you would typically do this, a historical image over, say, a recent photo of something, so that when somebody slides, so a good example like pre-hurricane and post-Florence. right? What does the flooding look like? You would have satellite images, and this gives you that nice functionality. And it's literally drag and drop in this tool. You take two images, you add them, and it creates this slider for you. So you get kind of higher level functionality with very simple intuitive interface. You know, you can do images, just slides, full screen images. There's another bad example of a slider window. Here's another one where like it's kind of like this JavaScript base. You can flip through images like a flip book. So again, you just add the images and the tool gives you this kind of higher end functionality. And then you can do things like, you know, kind of like the animated adding videos. So this is actually a way to get some higher end functionality and do cooler looking things. And it's a really intuitive, easy interface. And the way to get to this is just go to, for all of us who use the Microsoft web client, where you go to like mail.duke.edu and you can just click on this little box. Okay,
So this is, as he showed you this is also a really good example of just that essay that you saw there. How would you grade that? This here. If this is an essay, how would you grade this?
Fat ass.
But this might be something your students give you, right? And so showing them examples beforehand and actually coming up with good and bad, you're going to have to do that. Because if you assign a transmedia essay or a digital essay, or you allow them to do these in place of a paper, and you get this, what are you going to do with it? So you need to have criteria, because this is the kind of stuff you're going to get. So be thinking about this before, because it actually turns out is really hard to assess something like that. Because you think, you know, student spent, because then you know, like, how much time do the students spend on this? How much thinking do they do? Are they telling a story? Like, what do they intend to do? What did you know, if they had these lofty goals but they were limited by the tool, what does that mean? And so you really need to.
They use that flip image thing to try to fool you,
Yeah,
and the content's not really good, but they try to make it look fancier, right?
Right. So these are good examples of what you might, if you assign a digital essay and you say check out Sway, you're going to get something like that. How are you going to grade that? Think about that beforehand.
Yeah, so this is just another example that's, you know, telling the story of the Haka dance, and you know they're able to tell a linear narrative, but you can bring in some videos, right? So here's a rugby team that, for better or worse, decides to do this dance prior to all their matches.
They have about a 95% win rate, so it works really well.
So, but the idea of here, this student gets to bring in some contemporary media talking about a historical thing, so this just kind of opens it up a little. And I mean, this isn't a bad look. And this student, all they did was type in some stuff and drag some images in. So you get a pretty decent looking output from not really needing to scaffold.
And so on this one, this is, you know, I would grade it as, does it have the traditional aspects of an essay? Is it properly cited? So all the rules that apply to an essay, citations on images, citations at the end, that's all still in play. But then you have to think about, you know, what did these added elements, what is this doing that a paper essay couldn't? And with something like, let's say you have a film class, the Sway seems a perfect platform for that, because then you can allow the students to talk about and show film clips, and that makes sense. So a lot of it is, how is this different? What does this add? Because if you have a website that could have been printed, then why?
What?
Right?
So the next,
we're kind of coming on
yeah,
time.
we'll just go quickly. The next one is StoryMap.js, and just to give you a quick example of a StoryMap.js, we go back to social movements, and this is just, it gives you this map here and allows you to correlate it with, you know, stories about that point on the map. So this was built for journalists, by journalists who are covering a story that has some sort of geographic location where
the tool was, not the project.
Yeah.
The project was students.
No. But where geography makes a difference in the meaning you're trying to tell in the story. So this kind of just takes you through kind of a walkthrough, and it has this geospatial element and allows you to add images, video, things like that. Right? So this is just kind of a, and it's all kind of a drag and drop interface. So you log in, it's web-based, so you don't need to have anything installed on your computer. doesn't matter what computers your students have, they log in, they drop a point on a map, and they add an image and some text, or a video and some text. So again, really intuitive, doesn't need much guidance to do.
And so this, are you showing timeline next?
Yes.
So this and StoryMap.js and Timeline.js are also two projects that look like you spent a whole lot of time on it, but you didn't, which are great. But that's an opportunity to say, is your is your project making an argument about time? Is your project making an argument about space? It's making an argument about space, maybe we can map it. It's making an argument about time. If time is a critical element of your argument, or your essay, or your project, maybe we can timeline it. So these are opportunities to do that.
And so, same thing, add images, videos, this is time-based, you just flip through, there's a little timeline down here at the bottom. As you can see from both of these examples, they're what is called Iframe Level. So they give you code that allows you to then embed them back into a website, if that website allows you to use iframes. So this is the same social movement site, and the students did these one-off projects, and then they were able to iframe them back into the larger structure of the site. So again, no technologies are needed. This uses Google Sheets, so you need a Google account, and that's basically it. And you enter in stuff in a spreadsheet, and then it produces that timeline for you. So again, not much guidance needed for the students. Those kind of assignments are easy for them to do, and as long as you focus on making sure that them using these platforms don't obfuscate bad research, you'll be okay, right? Because they'll be able to handle these, and you just have to create the assessment to say, do they still cover the content in the way that I expected if this was an essay?
And take the opportunity to scaffold questions about what does it mean to point, to plot something, and is this author reliable about where this actually took place? And so you can build up those kind of humanities questions, right, about when you're using the tool.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about a spatial tool, but it was more of a storytelling spatial tool with StoryMap.js. Some of the tools that we have that are pretty accessible here on campus are what I would call spatial analysis tools. And spatial analysis is just basically when you put points on a map, their position on the map and their relationship to each other is part of the meaning creation. Whereas the StoryMap.js, you're kind of telling a narrative of something that travels. This, you're putting things on the map and saying, hey, look at this compared to this, and that's where you're trying to find the meaning. And so these are more, I would say, spatial analysis tools are more of the lesson plan tools, because if you're going to do spatial analysis, you're going to have to learn something about what it is, like I just said. And some of the tools, how they work are a little bit more advanced than, say, log into Timeline.js or StoryMap.js. You'll have to know how to use some of these tools. So a couple examples we have here are Google My Maps and Geolocation. Oops, didn't want that one. And here's examples. So Imaging Canto is a project by Jennifer Weisenfeld, where she's looking at like postcards from different centuries in Japan, like post-earthquake kind of postcards, and those postcards of course have geospatial coordinates, and so she's able to put these different postcards on the map because she's using Omeka. And so an interface like this just allows the student to put a point on the map and then add the information about this, right? So this is a little bit easier than, say, you can walk me through your examples.
So Google My Maps is one of those where you don't really need to know how to do anything except double click and add some information. Right? This is a project I had my students do where they were mapping global ecological solutions. And kind of uninteresting as it is, because the projects were self-chosen, the students they had to research and find interesting ecological solutions across the world. So what would have been really fascinating, right, is if there were only, let's say, 12 ecological solutions and they mapped them and they could see, oh, well, there's a whole lot happening in Africa, but nothing happening in the US, right? So this is this map doesn't really say anything on its own, except for you can kind of, click on them and see more information about them and go to the link. But if you had 10 postcards, or if the so you see the issue here, right? So the map is really not saying anything because it's not comprehensive. There's no way it could be, I don't think. because there's new ecological, I mean, my students just couldn't do that. But there would be subjects where it would be very interesting to see things mapped and have kind of the story being told there. And it's super easy, and it's just using Google My Maps.
So it's as easy as a method, but it gives you a little bit more functionality in that you can draw lines, right? So you can start to make statements on the map. I don't know that these icons are doing anything, but you can have different icons to show different meanings for things. So this gives you a little bit more ability to do what's true geospatial, where you're putting points on the map and you want the viewer to compare, like, oh, look at how many tree-based icons versus wind-based icons are on here, right?
And another one of the interesting questions that comes up is that you can actually geolocate it to the Allen building at Duke. It can be very specific, it can be geo-coordinates. But then you have projects like, well, this is happening all over Africa, where do I put it? And then the students have to think through that, right? So it is, you really just push a button and you add information and you push enter, and I mean, it's stupidly easy to use.
But again, still,
But it comes up with something that's pretty neat looking.
with these kind of assignments, you're going to have to incorporate some helping the students understand what exactly it is that they're doing by putting these things on the map, right? So there's a little bit extra than just produce this sway or produce this timeline JS. There's more thought that goes into it. So it's a little bit more involvement from a class. And then the final one, story map. Story map is like a combination of story map JS and some of the geospatial stuff we learned about. When you get these slides, you can look at these links. It's accessible through the library. It's pretty intuitive to use, and it's really, really good. It's a really good, expensive tool. So just something to consider if you're looking for the students to tell stories that have some sort of geospatial component. And then the final one we want to look at is text analysis. So we started out at the very beginning with that, looking at all those texts put through that application. This text analysis is just another one of those that you have to incorporate kind of in a lesson plan, because you're going to have to incorporate things like what's the difference between raw frequencies and relative frequencies and things like that, right? So that you're going to have to learn some terms so that then when the students use these tools and see these graphs, they can make sense of these graphs. So that's kind of what we're talking about with these lesson plan assignments. And spatial and textual analysis are definitely more of the lesson plan based ones. And for textual analysis, a good tool you can use is Voyon. It's free, it's online, you don't even need to sign up for an account. You can go to Project Gutenberg, you can download 80 versions of a text and throw them up in this system and start to do some sort of like word frequency analyses and things like that. And just as a quick example, this was some class that looked at the WikiLeaks Clinton emails that were on the secret servers, and they were just doing things like, trying to get very high level understanding of all of these 30,000 emails without having to read these 30,000 emails, and just looking for certain trends, right? So here's Egypt and Mubarak and how often they appear. So these numbers 1 through 10 are the emails just in chronological order, and they're separated. There's 30,000, so each line is 10,000 emails, right? So that's the history of the email. And then the other axis is how many times those are used. So you get to see, like, if you don't want your students to read 30,000 emails, which I hope you wouldn't, just quick ways to look at them. Another example is like it allows you to do some kind of very rough network graphs as well. So this was using the CCs of these emails, who was talking to whom, right? So again, the emails were there, the students uploaded them to the system. It's not the nicest system to use, but it's somewhat intuitive, right? It will have a box to say, do you want to look at how frequent a word shows up? Do you want to see when this word shows up, what other words show up in context with it? So it's pretty straightforward, super easy to use, you don't have to install anything. So if you're looking to do text analysis, I would recommend that tool. But if you're doing text analysis, it's a much more involved thing. You can't just say, hey, go find the raw frequencies of this word in this text and expect the students are going to understand what the heck they're talking about, unless they're coming from statistics or something like that, or some harder study. And then just to return back, you know, it's all about scoping. It's like what you're interested in. I love He-Man. I grew up with He-Man. Sorry if that ages me. But I also love the Care Bears, so I'm an equal opportunity. You know, think about what you want your students to do. You know, what are your expectations for them, both technically and subject-wise. And with that in mind, just impossible to see here, but when I share these slides, this is every single tool we talked about in this presentation, and puts it in a matrix about how easy it is to use, how much technical skill is required, and then what are you going to get out of it? How good is the tool? How robust is the tool? So this matrix will kind of help you based on, you know, what your expectations are for the class and your expectations for students, help you find the right tool for you. And then finally, if you want to know about more tools, we have this Digital Humanities .duke.edu site where we talk about tools. If you're interested in learning about projects, we'll have any pedagogy projects that we talked about here on the site as well, so that can give you a good idea of what others are doing. And don't forget, your colleagues are as important, if not as more important than we are in getting you started on some of these things. To talk with a colleague who's done this kind of stuff is worth 10 times more than talking to me, and that's why Amanda's here. And then just thank you, and if you want to try this, email us. That's just the easiest way to start.
You guys have any questions for? We've got a couple minutes left. We're not kicked out of the room for a while, so.
I'll throw in one final note. Digital humanities projects are also an opportunity to talk about accessibility, which is important. So and there are experts on campus on digital accessibility. Even things like using certain colors in your visualizations. Some folks who are colorblind or differently abled cannot see the different colors. So that's learning about and familiarizing yourself with kind of accessibility issues and digital accessibility and user design kind of thing. It's not only is it interesting, but it's an opportunity to bring up differently abled minds and bodies and how they would view your site. And there's experts on Duke for that, as well as copyright and ethics and all of that surrounding. Not that I don't want to overwhelm you with you need to know all this before you start, but there are, if these come up, you have a lot of resources that do to tend to those.
What about the other side of that, to thinking about students who have accommodations of various sorts? Are there types of projects that have worked particularly well for being accessible for creation for students?
So that hasn't come up yet, but I am mindful when I do the projects that they would be open to those. And then I always let students know that if there is any, they come to me and we'll do whatever we can to make a difference.
Yeah, most of these tools probably support things that don't interfere with things like screen readers and.
Right.
Maybe. But I don't know that they do. I mean, I think that's a big problem in the field, is that like a lot of these, anytime you get this interactive stuff, it's not accessible friendly.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, that's something to consider. But again, I think if you're going to get into this, thinking about, just knowing these tools exist, knowing what they're capable of so that you can properly assess a student's work in any of these platforms is the key thing, right? So, like, don't ever be, just because somebody's able to use story maps and that's a more advanced tool than, say, StoryMap.js, if the first one doesn't tell the story as well, or doesn't quite get the content right, these are things that should really be focused on. And so this was just kind of a presentation about knowing your aptitude and your time, and then just picking tools that maybe fit your agenda, and then just knowing how to properly assess it.